Thank you, Wolfgang, as always. Tonight I want to present a paper that it's not new in many respects. This is a text I wrote some time ago, and then just this year I returned to it to do a bit more work on it. I lengthened it, in fact, and clarified some things. But it's a text it's very dear to my heart, and I think you'll see why as I present it. So I thought it would be appropriate to offer it here tonight. 2 point. One person knows this text, that's Avital, and she has responded generously to it, so I want to thank her in advance. But I also want to mention that it will be in a volume to be published later this year with a facing translation in Spanish. And I mention this because the editor of Paradiso Editores in Mexico City is an EGS graduate. This is Alejandro de Cerda. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He's doing some, I think, very exciting work, bringing some of the EGS people into translation in Spanish and offering other writers. So it's something to look to, and I'm very, very pleased to have this connection, and I think it's very good for the EGS. So I do want to offer that little plug to get started. It's a slightly longer essay than I would normally give. I won't be more than 50 minutes, I believe, but I think it can be listened to. It shouldn't be painful. So I won't promise that it's short at the outset, but I do promise that you should be able to listen to this without too much pain. So the title of this is Jean-Francois's Infancy. And the Jean-Francois in question is Jean-Francois Lyotard. And the reason for my using just his first name is, I think, will become apparent. It has to do with the nature of the relationality and the relation that I want to discuss here. I'm going to read an epigraph, first of all, and this comes from it actually comes from the opening page of his volume, Lecture d'Enfance. I discovered, and I'm going to tell this story, but I discovered fairly late on that infancy had become an organizing theme for Jean-Francois Lyotard in his later work. And several books have it as a primary theme, The Inhuman, Lecture d'Enfance, but also a little text called Le Postmoderne expliqué aux enfants, which is just a little gem. You'll also find some material in Postmodern Fables. And what I want to read as an epigraph are a few lines from the opening page, which itself is a kind of epigraph to Lecture d'Enfance. He writes the following: "No one knows how to write. Everyone, the greatest above all," he says, "writes in order to capture in and by the text something he does not know how to write, what will not allow itself to be written as he knows. Let us baptize it infancia, what is not spoken. Blanchot wrote, 'Noli me legere,' you will not read me. What does not allow itself to be written, in the written, calls perhaps on a reader who no longer or does not yet know how to read." Again, that's from Lecture d'Enfance as a longer passage, quite beautiful. I wrote this very shortly after Jean-Francois Lyotard's passing, and it is in some sense commemorative and has to do with my relation with him. So I start with a kind of anecdote. First of all, as I was writing this, I had to note that it was not easy to write this text, and partly because it was very difficult to imagine that Jean-Francois was not there and not over my shoulder reading it with that very special mockery of his. And so I was quite uneasy as I started off. And I found, as I was rewriting this year, nothing had changed. I was still aware of his presence. I could still hear that withering irony that would greet anything too pious, and an irony which, and I'm beginning with my text now, an irony all the more sharp as it would be propelled by his reaction to a narcissism, his own, that he would always be the first to suspect. I can sense, as I write, even still today, his exasperation at any falsity, be it simply an evocation of his name that situates it among a set of fashionable, ultimately marketable references. And I can feel the deep, melancholic despair that would grip him as soon as he heard that note signaling the academic mode, the presentation of his work as a topic, however suavely it might be presented and situated in relation to other discursive sites. Does it come down to this, I hear him say, a position in the discursive field, all of it already consigned to oblivion as discourse? I find a tinge of pleasure in imagining the comedy he would find in it all, and I can sense how he would turn it in the direction of what the French language offers with the term humour. But it is precisely at that point of anticipating the liberating gesture that my fantasy breaks, and I remember he's not there to turn the old trick, that it's up to those who remain to achieve the peculiar transcendence he would have found. So how do we acquit ourselves? How do we constitute and assume his legacy? When I suggest that the task cannot be one of reviewing a body of work and a set of theoretical elaborations, I do not mean to suggest that we fail to honor him by studying his texts. After all, he took his philosophical and critical efforts very seriously. His restless movements between formal dispositif was not the sign of a casual attitude toward the discourses through which he moved. There was nothing cynical or nihilistic, nothing even pragmatic about his formalisms. I use his word. He worked very hard to get it right. At the same time, however, he never imagined that his theoretical labors would supply the right answer, le bon enchaînement, as he put it. He sought to hold his own and to win space in a field he sometimes constructed as polemic, but he never sought critical or philosophical hegemony by providing the correct or authoritative representation. He was devoted not to the concept, in fact, he was forever seeking its limits, but to thought, to winning space for thought. And more. Sauver l'honneur de penser, he wrote. Save the honor in thinking. The legacy is to be found somewhere there, I believe, from his tireless attempt to bring that imperative to the fore and to meet it. To be sure, his efforts were coupled to a devastating demonstration of the grounds for despair. He showed in volume after volume how thoroughly the task is menaced by the forces of the market and what he called complexification, or more simply, development. The unfolding of the financial crisis of the first decade of this century would have provided him with a weighty confirmation of his fears regarding the directions taken under the system's own duress in the era of economic liberalism, and developments in intellectual life would have occasioned a no less grim irony. But he also offered examples of how one might go on, how one might endure, as though there were a future to be prepared and to await. The lesson was not a teaching in the sense of a doctrine. It was something more like a performance. Moreover, the performance invited repetition. It said, "Here, translate this." Of course, the invitation made the best of necessity. There is no meta-language, he insisted. Do it as you will and as you can. You have no choice but to translate. But it also obliged in its generosity, as though the as-though called upon something, perhaps even claimed something. In Jean-Francois' playful "translate this," there was something perhaps not unrelated to the Anspruch of which Walter Benjamin spoke when he said that the past has the power to claim the present, that the past will find a freeing force the present, will find a freeing force in answering that claim. Jean-Francois, I might note, turned more than once to Benjamin's Berlin childhood for traces of that claim. Translate this. That is just about exactly the phrase by which I received that part of Jean-Francois' legacy that was destined or prescribed for me. That part that defines my assignment in now returning to his work again. Decorum urges me to add, not for me alone, of course, but I have to grant, with all the responsibility that this entails, that the legacy I am trying to think comes singularly, even if it exceeds any single inheritance in the very generosity of its shareable address. So perhaps I will be excused for beginning with an anecdote, though I suspect that in such a context, no excuse is necessary. Anyway, this is how Jean-Francois' legacy was transmitted to me, or this is part of the story, since it goes back almost 25 years. I remember first a passing conversation during his visit to Binghamton in 1989 that turned on the topic of infancy. I can't resist saying this. Avi, you once asked me, what in heaven's name actually is said in men's rooms? I don't know what prompted it, But I know that it ended with the following words to me. I sense this infancy is very strong in you. A scene from childhood, one might say. It marked me with an affect that was at once apprehension and infantile pride. But I hardly knew what to do with it. Nor did I grasp, even belatedly, what to do with it when Jean-Francois commissioned me to do a translation of his stunning essay on Kafka, the essay entitled Prescription. I simply did not grasp what it might mean that he had prescribed for me an essay on infancy, not even after a month's work with that text. I did not even get it when the essay I had translated was included in Lecture d'Enfance in 1991. Or perhaps I got it at this time after all. At least this is what I think now. Perhaps I knew that I had to find my way through this question of infancy before returning to his own work on it, for I avoided Lecture d'Enfance rather carefully. In fact, my avoidance, which ended only in 1999, lasted a full year past the time when I had completed my own work on the question of the Infans, work that was, in fact, dedicated to Jean-Francois' memory. What was I supposed to get? An assignment, I believe. Jean-Francois had assigned me a question that he knew concerned me intimately. His gesture was not disinterested, as I knew perfectly well from the fact that he apologized numerous times afterwards for having stuck me with a job he needed done quickly. The assignment came in the form of a request, but we both knew that it meant, translate this. And more than once, it was the middle of the semester after all, I found myself saying something like, yeah, well, translate this. But I also sensed that if he was using me, he was doing so as a teacher. By obliging me to read him in this very particular fashion, he was instituting a new form of relation between us. And I would come to understand, belatedly, that if his translate this was binding in its pedagogical force, it also had a freeing intent. Ultimately, it meant, translate this infancy from your own, bring it to writing. The assignment would fully emerge only after its goal had been realized. I would recognize it in reading Lecture d'Enfance. But I first had to go through the writing, which occurred some 8 years after I translated Prescription. Now, I can envision working with this in various ways, even playing with it, the child being the father of the child and so forth. This is familiar. And I tell the story in part because I think it touches upon some important issues concerning the teaching relation and translation itself. But here's the pertinent thing for this occasion. What the assignment made visible to me in Jean-Francois' text is something that I do not know I could have seen otherwise, at least in quite the same way. I certainly would have recognized the theme of infancy as one of his preoccupations, but I do not think I would have seen the manner in which it formed an integral part of his legacy. For me, at least, this legacy had to be handed over and taken over in the manner I have described before it could be visible. I had to do before understanding. And having now accepted the assignment, I think I can begin to approach the topic of Jean-Francois' infancy as more than a topic, indeed as part of what made his text obliging for those of us who continue to need to write after him and in his memory, and for those who will still be claimed by his text in years to come, like those children to whom he addressed Le Postmoderne expliqué aux enfants. I would like to begin by sketching how I link the topic of infancy to what I am calling Jean-Francois' legacy. Because after all, the assertion is somewhat counterintuitive. Infancy cannot normally be counted in that sum of acts and works, or even that familial burden we call a legacy. And from the perspective of the legacy's inheritance, there being no legacy, at least in symbolic matters, apart from its inheritance, we have to recognize that a legacy is something one takes on precisely in leaving infancy. To be sure, we receive our legacies from a kind of infancy, starting with the very first. They come with the name and in the touches and voices that convey a history of desire. But a legacy can hardly be said to be transmitted, even as phrase, I'm quoting Lacoue-labarthe there, until it is spoken. A legacy is of the symbolic, and by definition, the Infans is not yet. So how could infancy be part of a legacy? Answering schematically, I would try to put it as follows. Jean-Francois understood himself to be writing from an infancy and to an infancy. When he pointed to the task of saving the honor of thinking, he implicitly enjoined a repetition, a translation of that address. Now, there are at least two senses of the term infancy at work in the phrase I have just used, writing from an infancy to an infancy. And I shall try to develop their meaning and the possibility of linking them as I move through a set of Jean-Francois's texts. But to provide a hint of where I am going, I would like to cite lines from the conclusion of the 9th section of Le Postmoderne expliqué aux enfants, a section addressed to Jean-Francois's own son and dated June 12, 1985. This 9th section is devoted principally to George Orwell's 1984. It takes up the question of resistance, a resistance that Jean-Francois describes as bodily in this text, but which he also believes must be written. Having taken his distance in this letter from, as he says, the likes of Chomsky, Negri, Sartre, and Foucault, a group of intellectuals who, in Jean-Francois's view, perpetuate a notion of struggle derived from the Enlightenment, and having juxtaposed to them Adorno's chagrin vis-à-vis the fate of the Enlightenment promise in his turn to art, Jean-Francois returns to Orwell, whom he places on the side of Adorno. And he continues. I'm not saying that the line of resistance traced by Orwell's work is without problems. On the contrary, the appeal to modern ideals was an appeal to the universality of reason, and reason is, in principle, universally shared. But we have seen that this is not strictly true of the body, and certainly not of the unconscious body, if I can call it that, which imprisons each one of us in an untransmittable line of the body in the line of writing. The labor of writing is allied to the work of love, but it inscribes the trace of the initiatory event in language and thus offers to share it, if not as a sharing of knowledge, at least as a sharing of a sensibility that it can and must hold as common. Jean-Francois does not take this appeal to the task of writing to be without its own problems, but then he continues with these words to the young David. The problems created by the resistance I am describing will continue to surface. It is for us to elaborate them as it will be for you. What I want to say to you is simply this. Following this line does not mean shutting ourselves away in ivory towers or turning our backs on the new forms of expression bestowed on us by contemporary science and technology. It means that we use these forms in an attempt to bear witness to what really matters, the infancy of an encounter, the welcome extended to the marvel that something is happening, the respect for the event. Do not forget that you were and are this yourself, the welcomed marvel, the respected event, the mingled infancy of your parents. Again, what I want to remark in this extraordinary address to Jean-Francois's son, an address, again, intended for every reader, even if it has an absolutely singular import as a kind of gift and a kind of obligation, a kind of legacy. What I want to remark here is the passage from what we might call an infancy of the body to a mode of being that Jean-Francois thinks as an infancy of encounter. My aim is to address the nature and the possibility of that passage. I start with a brief evocation of the notion of the initiatory event. I take that phrase from what I just read. The initiatory event that is furnished by the same chapter from which I have just cited. It appears by way of a reference to what Adorno termed the micrologies of Walter Benjamin's One-Way Street and Berlin Childhood, brief scenes of a kind that can also be found in Jean-Francois's own essay, Scapeland. Of such micrologies, Jean-Francois writes the following. They do not describe events from infancy. Rather, they capture the infancy of the event. They inscribe what is uncapturable about it. And what makes an encounter with a word, an odor, place, book, or face into an event is not its newness when compared to other events. It is its very value as initiation. You learn this only later. It opened a wound in sensibility. You know this because it has since reopened and will reopen again, marking out the rhythm of a secret and perhaps unknown temporality. That wound led to an unknown world, though without ever making it known. Such initiation initiates to nothing. It just begins. Now, I cite this passage for the wonderful way in which it emphasizes the sheer contingency of the event and for the way it honors the empirical, even as it underscores that the fact of the event for the psyche derives from the way it represents an effraction as well as an opening for the sensibility that undergoes it. The empirical encounter, he tells us, has a radically initiatory character, however modest its occasion. In this sense, infancy is of the event, not its condition, in the sense of a subsisting state. As he puts it in his essay, Time Today, I quote, "What testifies is not at all the entity whatever it be, which claims to be in charge of this passibility to the event, but rather the event itself. What memorizes or retains is not a capacity of the mind, not even accessibility to what occurs, but, in the event, the ungraspable and an undeniable presence of a something which is other than mind and which, from time to time, occurs. End quote. Already now, we have under the name of infancy a sensibility or condition of affectability that is somehow indissociable from the touch to and in which it is exposed, but in some measure or some immeasure, unavailable to any synthesizing instance describable as the mind of a subject. We have, moreover, the opening to an unknown world and what he calls the retained rhythm of a secret temporality that allows the minimal designation of a recurrence from time to time. The event initiates, we are told, but it is already evident that there is no way of determining the actual newness, or for that matter, the ancientness, of a presence and a relation that may in some way be returning anew, for that onto which this event opens has never been fully available to memory, and thus suffers a form of primal repression, as well as a relay of secondary repressions. Moreover, for the fact that what returns is a relation to difference, as we will continue to see, there is no ground for sure recognition. The event initiates in its apparent contingency because what it brings back recurs as forgotten and in some degree inaccessible. What echoes in the event has never been. Infancy, once again, is not the infancy of a subject, or it is so only belatedly and never fully. It will never surrender to the hold, the mainmise, the grip, and this is something that Avital has developed nicely. It will never surrender to this hold, this mainmise of a self-present reason, which itself, therefore, can never quite get hold of itself, and which introduces a potential havoc in the child-adult relation. Nevertheless, it is there, from time to time, in an inexplicable recurrence, or by something like a reawakening of sensibility to an obscure participation in a temporality that escapes any synthesis. What of human sensibility, then, is or will have been infantile in this manner, that it should be so vulnerable and so exposed to forgetting? The answers explored by Jean-Francois tend to be sketchy, for reasons I will continue to touch upon as we proceed. But they take form in a confluence of discursive fields, psychoanalysis, philosophy, and what I will name a thought of art, that ceaselessly challenge one another, these fields, as he strives to align an account of an always singular human experience that exceeds the concept with formal articulations that do not shy from the requirements of critique and a transcendental approach, as he practiced it in his readings of Kant. For the infantile, as we might expect, his primary reference is psychoanalysis. Thus he will evoke an infancy of the body that he calls in his address to the young David psychoanalytic or unconscious. Borrowing a distinction from Merleau-Ponty via Claude Lefort, he explains that there is a phenomenological body that links the sentient being to a world that it makes and that makes it, but also another that withdraws from the world, I quote, into the night of what it has lost in order to be born into that world. The phenomenological body is of the world then, but it is shadowed by another that is hostage to what Jean-Francois, following Lacan in particular, terms the thing, la chose. The two must be thought together, he insists, for they form a unique sensibility. The point of view, the point of listening, of touch, of scent. But this absolutely singular, untranslatable manner of deciphering what arrives, this singularity of resonance, or this idiom, as Jean-Francois refers to it, is divided always within itself. The insistence of something, as he says, at once more familiar and more strange, disrupts, alters, or even suspends the singular idiom of sensibility. Its murmur constitutes what Jean-Francois terms in another essay, I quote, a suffering and perceiving and conceiving that sets up fields of perception and thought as functions of waiting, of equivocations. This other voice, to which Jean-Francois refers in his essay on Freud in Lecture d'Enfance, this plaint, both shapes sensibility and indetermines it, exposing sensibility to the initiatory event. Now, as Jean-Francois develops his thought of an unconscious body in his later efforts to describe what he names a phrase affect, he will come to question even the reference to the notion of body, as he considers the unsituatable character of a pre-genital excitation of sensibility that remains infantile and unavailable to the adult for the fact that its trace withholds itself from the articulations of the adult phrase, which bear with them the articulations of sexual difference. The phrase affect testifies or communicates, he says, in a rudimentary way, nothing more than the presence of an affect, and it is otherwise without reference or address, to use the language of Jean-Francois' phrase analysis. So it's a very fragmentary phrase in his using his terms. The affect may in fact be said to have a sexual character. He's thinking of the instance of Emma and Freud's famous case. It may be said to have a sexual character, but will not yet be determined by sexual difference, as structured in adult discourse. A differend will thus always attend any encounter between this infantile phrase and an adult translation or linkage. But rather than follow Jean-Francois immediately into the phrase analysis of le différent and his late efforts to supplement that undertaking, let me stay a bit longer with the theme of an infantile affectability and the body of infancy. We broach here Jean-Francois' reading of Kant and his vast labors in the field of aesthetics, which can hardly be summarized in this context, no more than can the extensive engagement with psychoanalysis. But Prescription, that essay I translated, offers a rather dramatic introduction into this problematic, when Jean-Francois draws from the Kantian reference to develop the notion of a bodily aesthesis that is prior to any mise en ordre, be it through the forms of sensibility, ordered to cognition, or in general to any law. Meditating on pages from Kafka's Penal Colony that bear an almost hallucinatory glare, Jean-Francois is led to consider the pertinence of the term aesthetic for the application of the law to an innocent body, innocent for want of knowledge of the law, and even resistant to it in its peregrinations, and thereby at fault for a law that must produce and display its authority. I quote, "To be aesthetically, in the sense of Kant's first critique, is to be there, here and now, exposed in space-time and to the space-time of something that touches before any concept or even any representation. This before is not known, obviously, because it is there before we are. It is something like birth and infancy, infans, there before we are. The there in question is called body. It is not I who am born, who is given birth to. I will be born afterwards, with language, precisely upon leaving infancy. My affairs will have been handled and decided before I can answer for them, and once and for all. This infancy, this body, this unconscious remaining there my entire life. When the law comes to me with the ego and language, it is too late. Things will have already taken a turn. And the turn of the law will not manage to efface the first turn, this first touch. Aesthetics has to do with this first touch, the one that touched when I was not there. This is not the place to develop this negative aesthetics, commanding all great art, all writing, and that only reveals itself openly in modern literature and art. Its obligation, its constitutive prescription, is to acquit itself of this insensible touch through the means of the sensible. The touch is necessarily a fault with regard to the law. It has its place and moment in a savage or alien space and time that are foreign to the law. And to the extent that it maintains itself, persists in the mode of this immemorial space-time, this savagery or this sinful peregrination is always there as a potentiality of the body. Now here, the anthropological seems almost to prime the transcendental, so to speak, as the broader condition of infancy is drawn upon by simile, he says it's something like infancy, to describe the state of affectability that distinguishes it, but which surely subsists in some manner, obliging us to speak of the infantile insensibility to which so much of the art to which Jean-Francois alludes in this passage is devoted. But the crucial point to be underscored in this passage concerns the heteronomy of this body that is brought to existence before it is brought to a law in which it can never quite submit by reason of the exposures it has suffered in a space and time, or spaces and times, that will never be its own, or that of a reflective consciousness. The exposing, animating touch has excited into movement and is at the same time inseparable from an opening onto irremediable loss or relation to a thing that is no thing, yet somehow there. But the time and space of the stirring of affectability that has occurred, this excitation, the animation and the opening onto difference, cannot be situated. The heteronomy of the infant body, the suffering of a difference, sexual difference, but only if we understand this in its ontological reach, remains as the condition of possibility of a recurring exposure whose history remains secret and whose new return cannot be anticipated or produced. Condition of possibility is a clumsy expression given what it evokes of a standing subsistence. We are approaching here something more like a latent being exposed, a latent susceptibility to exposure that the adult will come to know in the awakening of what Jean-Francois will name a soul. The infant body, or the body of infancy, would thus be something like an intemporally persisting site of exposure, the site of a latency, but first of all the site of a suffering for which words like désolation, misère, défaillance, désappropriation, and again, misère as a title of a text, come repeatedly to Jean-Francois' writing in an ultimately vain effort to honor the mind's inescapable dependency in relation to this pre-inscription of relation, or what he will often call its debt. The insistence of these terms in Jean-Francois' reflections on infancy, misère, défaillance, and so on and so forth, cannot be overstated. They constitute something like a Grundton for his treatment of this topic. But it is, once again, a bodily suffering of difference, and as such, the remaining site of an opening. This is sexual difference, once again, but prior to the determinations of gender and echoing with the enigma of a nothing that is somehow there. I quote, "What is the event of sexual difference if we strip it of its scientific or cognitive denomination?" Jean-Francois asks in his essay on Hannah Arendt. And he continues in a powerfully condensed passage. I quote, "It is the enigma," this event of sexual difference, he asks, what is it? "It is the enigma of there being a relation with what has no relation. That is, in knowing that it is born and dies, the soul, aptly named, bears witness to the fact that there is not only what it is, but the other of what is. Of course, this relation does not take place when it takes place. It has taken place, and it will take place. Thus, it will have taken place all at once, appeared too late, disappeared too soon. And this is because my birth is always only recounted by others, and my death told to me in the stories of the death of others, my stories and others' stories. So that inasmuch as it is essential to this relation with the nothing, whence I come and where I am going, that it be related to me, the relation with others is also essential to the presence of absence, for it is from there that this presence of absence comes back to me. Essential, too, is the fabula to which the pulsation of beginning and end lends rhythm." That's a difficult quotation. I'm going to comment on it just a little bit right now. And what I'm going to do as I go forward is return to this reference to a fabula, because you'll see him say that we only know about infancy through stories. But then he ends with this reference to a fabula with a cadence of its own that belongs to the beginning and the end. And I think these two references to fiction have to be distinguished. So I'm going to explain that. This fabula, as we will see, finds its possibility in infancy and is of a quite different modality from any stories about the infant that was there before we were, or any account of the deaths of others, which can never suffice to call us to our mortality in the sense of a being toward. These stories about us, what do we know about our infancy? What we've been told by our parents, and these get elaborated and documented by photographs and twisted in various ways. But that's what we know of our infancy. But then there's this fabula. So these stories then that he says that are told us surely shape what we will construct of an infancy, but they do not bring to speech the exposure that occurred there and the exigencies, including a fictioning, that were occasioned by it. So I think we have to distinguish this fabula to which he refers, which derives from the infant's own experience of a relation to the beginning and the end, and these stories. Following this distinction, then, it's critical to pause over the furtive reference to a relation to others in the penultimate sentence from the text I've read, from the paragraph I've read. For what Jean-Francois broaches with this phrase is the immense question of being with, what Heidegger termed mitsein. Again, it is not a matter of the presence of an adult perspective unavailable to the infant or the analysand, but rather a question of the manner in which another, in some communication of their own presence-absence, recalls infancy to the adult. That is, somehow brings it back. It is only because a relation with others is originally constitutive for our being that such a provoking exposure is possible. The transferential relation as developed and practiced in psychoanalysis is exemplary here. And clearly some assumption regarding such a provocation informs Jean-Francois' understanding of what he means to write from an infancy to an infancy. If we can provoke in another an infancy by our writing, there must be this relationality to which I'm trying to read out of this passage. But from Jean-Francois' tentative suggestions on the theme of community and his furtive references to the relation of love, it seems clear that far more is left to be said about the place and recurrence of infancy in the relation of being with. And bearing in mind the importance to Jean-Francois of the aesthetic relation, one must surely bring to bear in this discussion the problematic of mimesis, that natural path of learning and pleasure followed by children, as Aristotle notes at the outset of his Poetics. But to stay with the trajectory outlined at our start, that is, from an infancy to an infancy, I want to attend to the strong reference to a soul that also appears in the passage I've just cited. For it is a term that insists in Jean-Francois' treatments of infancy, and particularly in those discussions that address the aesthetic relation and what it communicates of the infantile in human finitude. The anima, as Jean-Francois defines it then, is an opening to aesthetic experience in the strong sense of this latter term, experience connoting the danger of a passage, if we attend to its etymology. The soul, then, exists only as affected aesthetically, Jean-Francois insists, but it is also something like the animated fold in this experience, what suffers and passes through in a transcendence that opens onto thought. It knows infancy and is thus infantile in its way. Jean-Francois will insist on this. But we may presume that it only emerges with the passing of early infancy in the constitution of a relation to its dependency. We might thus say that the soul is the body/thought that survives infancy, but also, in some enigmatic way, survives in it, even if this perdurance is offered only punctually. But exactly what intermediary has been evoked here with this reference to the soul? Once again, the term appears to allow for the possibility of a vital and thinking relation to what Jean-Francois has posited as an irremediable heteronomy of bodily exposure. This heteronomy, as we have seen, is both precognitive, opening before and exceeding any possible schematization serving understanding, and premoral, or amoral, because it escapes the hold of any synthesizing act of reason. But clearly some assumption of that heteronomy is required if it is to be possible to think something like an exigency for thought or for art, or the possibility of, as he puts it, extending the line of the body in the line of writing. Why should thought heed, otherwise, its haunting presence and absence? How could it? In short, were there not something like this relation Jean-Francois calls the soul, there could be no respect for infancy. But what is the relation between body and soul? Needless to say, these questions are not new, nor are they easy. And as I've tried to suggest, we will not find definitive answers in the course of Jean-Francois' many meditations on infancy, though we consistently do find, I believe, an awareness of why consistent answers cannot be furnished. Once again, the abbreviated character of his appeal to the motif of sexual difference suggests that he does not hope to provide an account of the origin. And when he does follow Freud's speculative theorizing with attentive care, he makes it quite clear that theory is at its limits. We see this in the meditation on the phrase affect, as I have noted, but we may also return to the uncompromising analysis provided in Discours Figure of the brief text by Freud entitled A Child is Being Beaten. There, in a critical analysis that predates the strong thematization of infancy in Jean-Francois' work, but takes strong recourse to it, The evidence of a heteronymous relation leads Jean-Francois to posit what he terms an incompossibility of subjective positions, a veritable dispersal of subjectivity marked in a phantasmatic utterance, a call or a plaint. A child is being beaten. The dispersed subject of the phantasm, as Jean-Francois describes it, is never present to itself in any form of self-reflection or self-perception, and thus never constitutes a unity. For while Jean-Francois thinks it is possible to define a position de signifiance in the figural matrix that generates the phantasm, he also insists that the formal unity of the figural matrix, which is required by any description, is fundamentally disrupted. The rhythm of the phantasm of beating is marked by an arrhythmia, and thus Freud's conclusions, like Jean-Francois' own, can be no more than suppositions. The suffering body does not lend itself to conceptual grasp, even if it is not without relation to thought. Once again, the relation is not properly encompassed by thought. Indeed, it is a kind of disaster for thought. It is an ongoing provocation. In his essay, Can Thought Go On Without a Body?, Jean-Francois terms it an irreparable transcendence, and he continues as follows. Not only calculation, not even analogy can do away with the remainder left by this difference. This difference makes thought go on endlessly and won't allow itself to be thought. Thought is inseparable from the phenomenological body, although gendered body is separated from thought and launches thought. I'm tempted to see in this difference a primordial explosion, a challenge to thought that's comparable to the solar catastrophe. My point is to suggest that Jean-Francois never writes of infancy without awareness of that catastrophe or that disaster that it represents for thought and for his own writing. It is from that awareness, I think, that he offers in the essay Logos and Techne, or telegraphy, a concluding meditation on Dogen's metaphor of a shattering mirror to define the primal event that is the non-ground of the mind's infancy. Exposure to difference, Jean-Francois suggests, is like the timeless shattering that has occurred when a mirror is confronted with that image of the nothing there that Dogen describes as a clear mirror. Anamnesis, Jean-Francois concludes, would be the notification to stand up towards the clear mirror through the breaking. End quote. I believe that the appeal to Dogen here is not merely an instance of exoticism, however effective it might also be on that score. It is rather an implicit acknowledgement that what he seeks to think does not surrender to the concept or to any theoretical exposition. That if there is a passage from infancy to thought, it is not established by the concept. Figuration of some kind is an irreducible exigency for thought in its relation to the infant body. Indeed, the very name of infancy, and perhaps especially that name, must bear an essentially figural status in Jean-Francois' text, as is perhaps already clear from my citations. Infancy, as we learned from the essay on Arendt that I cited above, has an irreducibly fabulous dimension. But this is not to say simply that infancy can only be a metaphor for something that exceeds the limits of representation, nor even that it can only be given in a narrative, a récit. It is to say that infancy also names the insistence, even the exigency of the fictive or the figural in conscious life. That exigency that gives the insistence of the primal scene, or what I tried to call the infant figure. So, we can only talk about infancy by recourse to a kind of figure, but at the same time, what I'm trying to say, what infancy represents, is the exigency of figurality itself, the necessity of a fictioning for the mind in its relation to its own immemorial past. And it is only by a kind of engagement of that figural exigency that the passage we are trying to think from body to thought via soul can be made. Or so Jean-Francois supposes, and that supposition is itself offered as a willing participation in the exigency of the figural. When Jean-Francois writes of infancy, I want to suggest, theory is passing into a mode of supposition that is not fiction, but also not separable from it. The reference to something like a soul that knows and is perhaps moved to instigate the interrupted fabula of its infancy partakes of that supposition. Jean-Francois describes this supposition in that same essay on Arendt, and I want to concentrate briefly on his argument there in order to begin the passage to what I called earlier the infancy of encounter. So I've started with the body of infancy, and now I'm going to that second sense of infancy that Jean-Francois wants to call upon and call forth. The context of his discussion of infancy is Arendt's own meditation on birth and the faith and the hope that is brought to the human condition by the possibility of a creative action that represents in the natural and always ruinous succession of human affairs a kind of natality. Birth, as Jean-Francois summarizes what speaks to him in this meditation, is, I quote, the event of a possible radical alteration in the course compelling things to repeat the same. Infancy is the name of this faculty in that it brings to the world of being the astonishment of what, for a moment, is nothing yet, of what is already without yet being something. End quote. So, a faculty of astonishment, he calls it this time. To understand this use of the term, we need to turn back to an earlier section of the essay where he develops what he calls the impugnment of melancholia, or the refutation of nihilism. In other words, the possibility of a survival vis-à-vis the kind of vision of history that prompted Walter Benjamin to offer his image of the backward-driven angel. Melancholia, he says, sees nothing but loss and a constantly withdrawing being that strips even birth of promise. But melancholia forgets, he says, the relation of the soul with being or non-being, the enigma of apparition. I quote, rather than nothing, being gives entities, instants, objects. Since being appears in objects, it gets forgotten, yet it gives objects. Something happens. End quote. Even in the extreme of an accelerating nihilism, and perhaps he adds we must go to that extreme with the last man, the one who suffers or administers the banality of evil, even in the extreme there dawns the possibility of a joy, a word Jean-Francois takes from Pascal. I quote, the dark joy of a request made stronger for its being more improbable and thus more threatened by annihilation and more openly confronted by the truth of nothingness. A request, he says, and then falls back to what he terms a scruple, the scruple of an as though. I quote, this is from the essay on Arendt. The mind, thrust into the ordeal of nihilism, onto the road to despair and skepticism, which is permanent, knowing that there is nothing to do or say, no valid entity, no entity even which is, acts even still as though there were. In no way is the effect of this clause cynicism, this even still. Cynicism remains derivative of nihilism and perseveres through its activism in the melancholia of nothing is worth it. Nor is the effect a ludic form where a corpse dons the colors of life in a grimacing and macabre irresponsibility. Nor is it an artist's metaphysics of will and values. The effect, rather, is infancy, which knows something about the as though, which knows about the pain of impotence and the complaint of being too small, of being there late compared to others, and as to its strength, of having arrived early, prematurely, which knows about broken promises, bitter disappointments, failings, and abandonment, but which also knows about dreaming, memory, question, invention, obstinacy, listening to the heart, love, and real openness to stories. Infancy is the state of the soul inhabited by something to which no answer is ever given. It is led in its undertakings by an arrogant fidelity to this unknown guest to which it feels itself hostage. Antigone's infancy. I understand infancy here, I'm still quoting, as obedience to a debt which we can call a debt of life, of time, or of event. A debt of being there despite everything, and in relation to which only the persistent feeling of respect can save the adult from being no more than a survivor, a creature living on reprieve from annihilation. Infancy, as it is described here, then, is the effect of this modality of being guided by the as though. But it is also, as the preceding page makes clear, and I've already cited a good part of it in the preceding, it's non-ground. I can find no less clumsy an expression, but I want to underscore that it is from infancy, from the relation with what has no relation, that the as though proceeds. The capacity to act even still, and in the supposition of a futurity, entails bringing into movement what the soul has known of a releasement to imagination, wonder, and so forth, even as it renews an enigmatic bond. Antigone's Philia, for example. For the adult, this experience is a remembrance of finitude. The as though, once again, does not take its freedom from the abstractions of a negative stance, such as irony or cynicism, always a refuge of the self, nor does it proceed from the kind of giddy speculation that Benjamin described in his book on the German Trauerspiel, Nor, finally, is it satisfied with the comforts of a form of aestheticism, under the guise, for example, of an autopoiesis, or what was found in the late 1990s in attempts to wed contemporary pragmatism with Foucault's late reflections on what he called the care of the self. Rather, it proceeds from the mind's infancy, the soul's fabulating relation to origin and end, and its arrogant fidelity to the unknown guest to which it feels itself hostage. It proceeds from it and sustains it in what it brings of a legacy. The passage from which I have just cited, from Arendt, the essay on Arendt, continues as follows, I quote, "It is true that one knows quickly that death will prevent any acquittal of what is owed," he's referring to that debt, "that it will come always too quickly, and for this alone one can fall back into melancholy. But infancy consists in the fact that one is and does as though it were a matter of acquitting oneself of the enigma of being there all the same, of making the heritage of birth, of the complex, of the event come to fruition, but to transmit it and for the sake of its remission, to make it bear fruit in accordance with its constitutive poverty and misery, that is to say, to make it fructify, I'm not trying to pronounce that, as the debt of a beginning, the debt of a tradition and the tradition of a debt." I will return to this question of legacy, but I want to suggest, first of all, and I'm starting to approach my conclusion now. I want to suggest first that the phrase arrogant fidelity requires a bit more development than Jean-Francois ever gives it, at least to my knowledge. Because he is identifying an inclination of the soul, as he terms it, that I take to be the original condition of any faculty of enthusiasm or any opening to the event. I would speak of a kind of lending or even giving to the exposure that happens in the soul's opening to the nothing. If there is an infancy of encounter that is something other than a forced or self-deluding wishfulness, it is because the soul has opened itself to encounter, has said yes in some way to what has come upon it. Blanchot, whose meditation on infancy echoes constantly in Lecture d'Enfance from the very first page, speaks of survival not as an arrogant fidelity, but rather as a kind of acquiescence to the refusal of what comes in the initiating event, the advent of nothing, which refuses itself because the mind cannot hold it. So, in Blanchot there's acquiescence, there's a yes, and I think this yes is a condition of the possibility of opening to the event, which certainly Jean-Francois is aware of, I think, but he's not pushing far enough. Heidegger is perhaps thinking of such a relation when he evokes his own figure of a child in the context of his meditation on Gelassenheit, and Levinas is speaking of such an acquiescence, I believe, in his meditation on the yes, in 4 Talmudic readings, to which Jean-Francois points in his chapter on obligation in Le Différent. If infancy is to be something like a faculty of enthusiasm, it is because it proceeds from a kind of yes. The child gives itself to the other, and indeed this giving takes a fabulous form, but in the fable there is a yes that echoes even among all the infantile no's. So, a yes must be accented in Jean-Francois' account, I believe, but the fundamental point he is making in the essay on which I have been commenting holds no less. If it is possible to envision surviving the grounds for despair provided by this century, in some a spreading banality of evil in the face of multiple forms of devastation, it is because there survives in the mind an affirmative relation to non-being, and thus the capacity for opening to the event, for projecting upon an is it happening. This is not a childlike optimism. The joy that is known in infancy cohabits with terror, if only the terror of the jouissance it has known. The yes is radically dispossessed. It opens, and it opens onto, Jean-Francois says, a desert of desolation. Again, I would refer to all the metaphors of destitution, peregrination, misère, défaillance, and so forth. Nevertheless, this desert constitutes the ground or the non-ground for supposing that the event could come, for proceeding as though encounter could happen. As though. I'm going to hasten to a conclusion by suggesting that this as though is what invites to acts of filiation or affiliation in relation to Jean-Francois' text, and thus to something like a legacy. I believe it is possible to say that it is present in every act by which Jean-Francois promises himself to the event, in every act of writing. Readers will remember the striking words near the end of the reading dossier that opens Le Différent. I quote, "In writing this work, the author had the feeling that his sole addressee was the, is it happening?" End quote. He was writing for thought, conceived here as an expectant, even anxious opening or receptivity to the new. He was projecting upon its possibility and its passibility, committing or promising himself to it as though it could come. Now, I shall not review the traits of infancy that already mark Jean-Francois' descriptions of the event in the différent. I'm thinking, for example, of his remarks concerning the weakness of the phrase. But the words I've already quoted from the survivor of the essay on Arendt should suffice to allow me to say that he was committing himself to the infancy of encounter there. To no particular reader, therefore, but to every reader who would be affected by this modality of projecting upon the possibility of thought, this impossibly confident manner, almost messianic in presumption, of proceeding as though it could happen. But why should any reader find an invitation in that address, a provocation even? I will answer briefly, rehearsing what is perhaps already quite clear. The invitation lies, I think, in the as though. But we must understand this leap of thought in all its complexity, that is, with all the complexity of the passage to which I have tried to point, the passage from the infancy of the soul to the infancy of the event. I will reduce this complexity by speaking of a double movement, but let me try, nevertheless, to offer a little sketch. I would suggest that Jean-Francois' identification of his addressee as a kind of coming thought, a coming reception of encounter, leaves the reader in a kind of abandonment, even as it invites this reader into the promise or the commitment that is made. Following the invitation could always prove, in fact, to be no more than a spectating. You sit back and read. Though even this relation would already engage, to some degree, the fictive or the fabulous dimension of the as-though, and thereby engage to repetition. But this invitation would be gentle, in no way constraining or provoking, however stimulating, were it not for the fact that it is doubled by a dimension of obligation, an obligation that stems from the fact that the projection upon an infancy of encounter proceeds from an infancy that it remarks or even summons as it promises itself to the encounter. The commitment, the address to the infancy of encounter, repeats the yes of infancy that is its non-ground. It brings it to speak. Even le différent, I think we can say, reverberates with Jean-Francois' infancy. And this is all the more true of those more writerly texts that thematize this infancy. There is a saying of infancy that occurs throughout his writing. Jean-Francois points it explicitly in the preface to Lecture d'Enfance, from which I quoted in my epigraph, when he writes of the thing that haunts the text in its separation from it. Let us baptize it, I'm reading again, let us baptize it infantia, he says, and continues, what does not speak, an infancy that is not an age of life and does not pass. It haunts discourse. The latter does not cease to put it aside. It is its separation, but it stubbornly persists thereby in constituting it as lost. Unknowingly, therefore, the discourse shelters it. It is its remainder. Blanchot wrote, this is the last part of that citation, Noli me legere, you will not read me. What does not lend itself to writing in the written calls perhaps upon a reader who no longer knows or does not yet know how to read. That call, then, I want to suggest, has all the traits of infancy. It says abandonment, weakness, misery. But it also says yes to the exposure in which it has opened and to which it has willingly exposed itself in this yes. It says exposure again. That exposure, Jean-Francois assumes, has an exposing force. It is for this reason that it obliges, or that it can be shared. As Jean-Francois said in his address to David, the labor of writing is linked to the work of love, but it inscribes the trace of the initiating event in language, and it offers it in this way to a sharing, if not the sharing of knowledge, at least that of a sensibility that it can and must hold as common. Writing, as Jean-Francois understands it then, must presuppose the communicability of its exposure. Its commitment to infancy presupposes the reader's infancy. I'm tempted to give presuppose here an active sense and say that writing supposes and presupposes, or supposes and deposes, since the communication of infancy opens a kind of dispossession. And it is in this double movement that it prompts to repetition. It disposes, let us say, to repetition of the as though, of the commitment to thought. Again, Jean-Francois' promise, or his manner of promising himself, always proceeds from the relation to what has no relation. Its suppose is always redoubled with the disposing saying of infancy. For this reason, his saying, his writing, works very much in the manner of that address that opens Blanchot's own primal scene in the writing of The Disaster. You remember the first line of that famous text. You who live later, close to a heart that beats no more, suppose this. This is an invitation not simply to entertain the narrative that follows, the narrative of the birth and the death of the Infans, but to perform that narrative, to write it from the ground of the infinity that comes to that writing. Suppose this, Jean-Francois says, partagez le récit. There is an obligation in that dress, once again, but it must be assumed, or rather reassumed, in an act of writing. An act which constitutes from its own destitution and exposure what Jean-Francois calls at one point in his essay on Arendt, true or real filiation. His legacy of infancy will happen, I want to say, if we write it. It will have been up to us, his abandoned, arrogantly faithful children. Thank you.